If we're trying to render a huge list with a v4, it's going to cause some performance issues in our app. Not only will the initial page render be slow, but scrolling will also get pretty laggy due to the number of elements that we're trying to render. Luckily, there's a solution called virtual scrolling, and more specifically for lists, list virtualization. And virtual scrolling is a performant way to render large lists by only rendering divs that are near the current viewport. We can see it in action on sites like Twitter, where it uses virtual scrolling and infinite scrolling to efficiently display tweets. So example, at the top of the timeline, we can see that these are the divs that render individual tweets. And as we scroll, more tweets get loaded, but the number of divs stays relatively small compared to the number of tweets that we've seen. By only rendering what's needed, we can get better render performance. There's a couple of different strategies to implement this, but in this video, we're going to take a look at Vue uses useVirtualList composable, as well as the useInfiniteScroll to create a similar setup where as we scroll, new items get added to our list, and we only display the list items that we need. So before we start using it, let's walk through how the useVirtualList composable works. If we look at our demo, we can see three levels of elements. First is a container for our virtual scrolling area, and then skipping ahead to the third layer, these are the list items that we're rendering. But this middle layer is where a lot of the styling magic happens. And this is the tricky part with a virtual list. Even though we're only rendering certain elements that the user can see, we still want the proper spacing above and below the render content so that the scroll area has the proper height. useVirtualList solves this problem by setting the height and margin top. This took a bit for me to understand, so let's look at an example. Let's say we're at the top of a list, and this blue area is our wrapper div. If we only want to render these elements, we still want our wrapper div to be the full height so that our scroll bar makes sense and shows the actual scrollable area even if only a few of those elements are rendering. So we can use the height property to add all that extra space at the bottom. Then let's say we're in the middle of our list. We have items above, items below, but we still want to only render this section. Like we just saw, our height will be our current scroll position to the end of our element, and to get the right spacing above our displayed area, we can use a margin top. useVirtualList does a lot of this for us behind the scenes, but I still think it's really valuable to understand how it's doing rather than just throwing the composable in your code. But speaking of that, let's go ahead and throw it in our code. Make sure you have Vue use installed, and then we can import useVirtualList. For our data, let's say we have an array of 50 items that each have some lorem ipsum text. And with useVirtualList, we can either pass it a static array or a ref, and it works all the same. And now we can call useVirtualList, pass it in our data, and then in our second options object, we want to specify the item height, and this height is used to determine which elements should be shown, as well as to calculate the margin top and height that we looked at earlier. For my example, each item is 96 pixels tall with 80 pixels in the height, and then another 16 as a margin bottom. There's another option called overscan, which loads additional elements on the top and bottom of your virtual list so that the scrolling experience is smoother when we're going outside the viewport. The default value of 5 works fine for this, so I'm not going to set anything. useVirtualList returns a few different properties, and the ones that we're going to be using are the list, which is the items that should be rendered on the screen, container props, which contains a ref, styles, and an on-scroll event, and wrapper props, which contains styles that include the height and margin top. And now we're ready to start rendering. So inside of a template, let's create our container div and bind our container props, our wrapper div and bind our wrapper props, and then create another div that iterates over our list. Each item returned by useVirtualList has a property called index and a property called data. So inside here, let's just print that out. Next, I'm going to add some styles. This is where you can customize the look and feel, but the essential styles that you need are a height on your container div and your height and or margin for each list item that add up to your item height. Let's check out what we have. So when our page loads, it looks like a normal page. And if we scroll, it still feels like we're scrolling through an ordinary list. But if we inspect element, we can see that we're not rendering all 50 divs. And even if we make this list bigger, say 1,000 items, it won't impact the rendering performance since we're only showing things around the current window. And a really cool use case for virtual lists like this is when we implement infinite scrolling, like sites like Twitter or TikTok have. So let's do that. But first, I want to say thanks to the sponsor of this video, Storyblok. Storyblok is a headless CMS that I've been using recently. I've been using the Nux 3 module, and I like how you can build Vue components that are called blocks, and then directly build with them inside Storyblok's visual editor. You can change the options that are then passed as props, so it really gives the best of both worlds where it's easy to use, but also doesn't limit the development side of things. And even though Storyblok works with any tech stack, I'm slightly biased towards Vue, and Storyblok has a fantastic Vue client. In fact, they're super supportive of the Vue community and just became diamond sponsors of the project, so I definitely recommend showing them some love, and if you want to check them out, there's a link in the description. Alright, let's get back to the video. So for infinite scrolling, once again, Vue use is my favorite library, and it has a composable built exactly for this. It's called useInfiniteScroll that takes a template ref and runs a function when we scroll all the way to the bottom. So let's import it and call it. The first is an element or template ref where we want to observe the boundary. If you remember, container props returns a ref that gets bound to our container element. So when we hit the bottom of that, we want to load more data. So our first argument is container props.ref. The second argument is the function that runs, and here could be an API call for more data, but for our example, we're just going to push some more dummy text to our array. And the third is an options object, and we just want to specify the distance from the bottom that will trigger our method. And we want to set that to 10 pixels. So as soon as we scroll and we're 10 pixels from the bottom of our container, we're going to load in more data. And that's it. If we look at our demo, as we scroll down, not only can we keep scrolling forever and it's still smooth, but I also put a counter in the top left to show that we are loading in more data as we scroll. And if you want to see the demo, there's a link to it down below. And just to tie it all back, if we inspect element one last time, we'll still see that we're rendering a virtual list. So all in all, this is a really cool technique. Let me know if you find this kind of video interesting, where it's more step-by-step tutorial based. As always, if you have any questions, leave a comment, and thanks for watching.